So, Christopher Upham, I'm ready to turn it over to you.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now there you are.
Finally.
Uh,
Sorry, I was trying on 3 different devices, if you can believe
oh
that. And I
no.
couldn't get any of them. And finally, I got this one.
Okay. So I'm Judy Castleberry. I'm the
Hi,
president, and I have
Judy. Nice to meet you.
nice to meet you. Do you have slides or anything?
No, I don't have any. No, it's
Okay,
just going to be me, unfortunately. Hopefully, I can be entertaining enough.
that's fine. I just wanted to know if you needed to share your screen or anything. So
No,
again, we've already done your introduction. We're just so glad
I
you're
heard
here.
that.
And we're all ready to learn. So take it away.
All right. Well, I've had my introduction, so I won't go through that. But what I thought I'd do tonight is do kind of a catch up and maybe a relearning of what the screen form is, and then we'll talk about specifically for adaptation. But I mean, it's just I write fiction and I also write screen, and it there's a bit of a difference and a bit of a learning curve into thinking how to write things for screen and what the screen. So that's what I'm going to present, and I'll present it in about 4 or 5 sections. And the first section is about the general film form. And what I wanted to do is I'm trying to make this thing useful so to determine how you as a writer can make decisions about how you want to engage with the screen form. Well, the varying forms of this visual medium with motion pictures and sound, it's broad, it's huge, and it extends from the 1 minute cat video you make for your kids to a 7 hour feature film like Bela Tarr's Se Tenango, to the 22,000 episodes of a German um, uh, soap opera called Unser Sandmädchen, and that's been running continuously since 1955. So it's a broad picture and it's a collaborative meeting, which means that you're no longer in the room with just your computer and your iPad or your writing pad. And the medium of film is, because it's collaborative, it's got 10 or 12 different separate functions to it, that in a professional situation you'll have somebody has to do all of these tasks. And the producing part, it's assembling all the collaborators, financing and making the movie. Then there's directing, which is essentially orchestrating the film. Then there's writing, an original screenplay or adapting a novel, a book, a play, an article. And then there's casting, photography, art design, props, costuming, staging, acting, editing, sound, and music. And each of these elements encompass many different professions. And on large productions, every has their own department. So any success in the medium in a professional context, it requires a real compelling orchestration of all these different elements. And why do film and episodic streaming, are they so powerful and so compelling? So what I'm going to tell you is what the medium has meant to me, and what from the perspective of a screenwriter. I have a good friend, Tom Schlesinger, who's a story consultant, and he says that story is energy. Like it or not, we surround ourselves with stories. We are stories. It's the primary way we communicate with each other and the way we define ourselves in the world. We write our stories in order to make sense of our world. And if they're compelling enough, our stories make their way out into the world to other human beings. Now, visual stories, movies, episodics, even animation, it's an ethereal form. It's like a dream, which is why we're fascinated by it, because these dream things we watch are powerful metaphors to understand the way we live. And in the darkness of a theater, or even increasingly on your big screen at home, the audience sits in the dark. We're less alert, we're more passive, we're more receptive to the images. We can set it down, but if we watch the thing all the way through, we are receptive. So the meaning of the film doesn't lie just in the images, doesn't lie just in the words, but in the vital links between human beings, both between the actors on the screen and then the audiences who receive these words, the sounds and images. And as creators of these images, we aim for an essence, a mystery, an enhancement of life. Film, medium that reorders time. Playing with time is the essence of film. When we watch, just like in our lives, everything is forever moving forward. And meaning, like in life, is indistinct, shifting, vague, as we allow space for the invisible and the imponderable. And screenwriting only exists to transmit certain feelings from one person to the other. The writer is at once conscious and unconscious. He deals with order and randomness. We are in unceasing motion that can seem aberrant and gratuitous because, essentially, as a writer and as a watcher of films, we are on a quest. A look here, a gesture there will say much more about feeling than words, and it will say it differently. So, how do you create a visible image? When we leave our room, we let our eyes extend and enlarge the screen instead of shrinking it and scrambling it. In other words, we're creating a world that exists beyond the screen. And because we're dealing in a collaboration medium, we have to allow for that and for chance. The picture in screenwriting must dominate. It's more important than sound. The mist of speech, the fog of images. It's about picture in motion and changing viewpoints. It's an intimate medium, and it is filled with unceasing movement. It's a dance between sound and images and words. And sound, you have to use it very selectively to illustrate movements, to dramatize actions, to intensify the atmosphere, to symbolize feelings, and to associate different relations. Think about sound in terms of space. It creates space. And music must be one with the picture. Ingmar Bergman, a famous filmmaker, Swedish filmmaker of the 20th century, said that all film is inhalation and exhalation. Tension and the reduction of tension is evident in every single craft involved in filmmaking. What we're trying to do is to put together a choreography of significant images, a dynamic pattern of the rhythmic signature of the scene, the rhythmic signature of the film, because they're moving in time, always forward. The events we want to depict are always happening as if it's the first time. Time, imprinted in what film captures, dictates how we edit the film. Editing has to do with stretches of times and the degree of intensity with which these exist and get recorded by the camera. whatever the motion is, whatever the camera gets, is what the film is made of, not what you intend necessarily. What we're doing is creating an inner world by cinematic means. As a writer, we're writing a blueprint, the basis of which is to explore. So those are general principles that apply to most films, most all films, even abstract ones. That what I've just talked about is how the feeling part of the medium. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about basic screen structure. Mostly the films we watch are created from the three, what you've heard of probably is the 3-act structure. And that is based on human perception, because the 3-act structure is similar to the way we see and perceive anything before our eyes. And the 3-act structure it's derived from Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle studied the Greek plays, and from that he evolved his theories. And essentially, the 3-act structure is a way of ordering any attempt at trying to depict reality. And in the first act, which is about 25% of whatever the piece is we establish a person or persons, situation, problems, characters, and then initially evaluate what we think, see, feel, hear about it. And this establishment phase of any work is called Act 1. And then Act 2 is we keep perceiving what we've established, and through events, we just develop a deeper understanding of what this accelerating story is. And essentially, that's about 50% of whatever the pieces we're writing. And then Act 3, we conclude and come to a climax in whatever the story we have developed. And that essentially, again, is another 25% of the structure. And furthermore, each of these 3 acts has a 3-act structure within each one of them, and that they're connected by something called turning points, that one act will become the other. There's a transition that does that. And overlaying and interweaving through these acts, there are 3 other different storylines that will take place in the 3-act structure. One is an outer story, and it's called the action line. And essentially, the action story is, will they rob the bank? And this is what you set up in your first act. You find the people, you see the bank, you see the situations, the characters, and then the second act is the furtherance of this outer story, but it's generally concerned with relationships, because stories are created about people. And so the relationships have to do with, will they be able to get along? Can these people, like a couple, can they get along so they can rob the bank? And all through the second act, we see matters of character coming up between these 2, 3, 4 people, whoever's robbing the bank. And then every once in a while, an action scene in furtherance of how they end up robbing the bank. And then the third part that is included in the 3-act structure is something called the inner story. Now, this is very subtle, and it's really about big life changes. And it has to do with the problems that are happening in the relationship story and the action problem. It's like, how do we figure out how to rob the bank? Well, we got to get the plans. We got to see what the police are doing. We have to see what the security is. That involves people. And generally the main character is the one. Most film events have a main character. There are ensemble pieces, but they are generally going through some kind of big life change. And in this example we're doing with the bank, it's, can the husband overcome his tendency to lie so he and his wife and the other people can rob the bank, or else in the end he decides that he doesn't want to lie, he wants to change his life. And this is set up as being intuitive from the audience in the beginning. You can see the main character is somewhat unsettled, and he's at a turning point in his life. And these various plot points where the acts turn, conflicts, big scenes, show big character, action, relationship moments of change. Because essentially in the motion picture, we're showing moments of change. So the 3-act structure has been kind of used by screenwriters as a loose guide to evaluate the possible success of a screen work. In a way, it's easy to understand, but it's very hard to execute because we're reproducing real life. And in order to do that, we have to believe this reality that the actors, the directors, the producer, and all the craftspeople have created. And so representing life is not as easy as living it, even though living it isn't that easy either. Most of these successful works show the human conflict between characters and their way of being and actions, and what the main character actually needs. What will transform his life? Like in the Oscar-winning movie, the Anora, the young woman is at a point where she doesn't want to be a stripper and a dancer and a sex worker, but she enjoys the money, she enjoys performing, she enjoys being free with her body. But what she actually needs is a deeper connection with intimacy. So her need is different from what her mode is. Her mode is making a lot of money because she's young and good looking and she enjoys partying. And what she needs, which to be a more mature human being, is to have a deeper understanding and intimate relationship. So that's generally what they call the internal spine of all these stories. And all of these are based on character. What does the human being do? What are they actually doing to try to achieve whatever goal they want? And all of this structure is honestly nothing more than the order in which the main character learns things. Okay. So I want to talk a little about the role of the screenwriter. Well, what does the screenwriter do? Most of you, I think, have experience in fiction writing, nonfiction writing, maybe plays, maybe you do have some screenwriting experience. But what your job as a screenwriter is to produce a structural blueprint for all the other collaborators so they can explore and build on your idea. And screenplays are an evolving format. If you want more familiarity with them, I suggest that you read current screenplays, read episodic screenplays, and you get a sense of what the language is, and what you need to create and what you don't need to have in them. And increasingly, the importance of a screenplay is that it's a selling document for studios, for producers, for showrunners. And if you're going to do it yourself for your own collaborators, you have to get your ideas onto paper, so you can share them with other people so they will help you and get whatever you want made. Um, in in the professional world, in the movie series marketplace, there are some preliminary story selling tools. One's called the log line. And what it is a one sentence metaphor for the film. Uh, like in the movie Honora, a young woman finds that she doesn't need to expose herself and exploit herself in order to be happy. Um, and then you expand that into a synopsis, which is a one-page summary of your story. And in Nora's case, it would be a young woman dancing meets a young Russian guy who apparently falls for her, and he takes her on a wild ride for several weeks, and she falls in love. He says he's in love, and then his parents refuse to allow them to marriage, and it just almost destroys the young woman, but she comes to her uh, senses by way of a friend and understands that she doesn't need a rich guy to take care of her. She needs to be able to open up, to be intimate with somebody. And then the third part of the selling uh, trio is something called the treatment, which is essentially a 15 to 30 page prose summary of that story that goes scene to scene to scene to scene. And this can be read. It can also be pitched, because a lot of visual stories are sold at meetings between studio executives and agents, producers, buyers, um, and the writer will come in and pitch them the story and tell them how great it's going to be, and they go through the entire story, and then they'll decide whether to finance it. And a lot of screen work is done on stages. Like, you will give them, they may like the log line, and then they'll pay you several $1,000s to do a synopsis, then more money to do a treatment, and then if they buy your pitch, they'll finance a script. And it can be $20,000-$30,000, and then certain number of rewrites. So it's a step process in order to sell these ideas. If you want to work professionally, an agent or a manager is almost, you have to have one to work professionally. It's very hard to break in without one, unless you want to make your own film. And I would think today, it's my opinion, that if you wanted to break in as a working screenwriter, it's probably essential that you go to Los Angeles. Now, the methods to screenwriting, they're just as varied as they are in fiction or nonfiction or poetry. Research about the world of your story is essential. You have to know your world very, very, very well. You have to know not just what's on the screen, what's going on outside of the screen, what happens beforehand, where's the world going afterwards, what exists outside of where this examination of these people that you're doing. And your working method is your own. You can use cards, you can use Post-its, you can use longhand, dictation, collaboration, isolation. I have a friend, Judy Rasco, that doesn't do anything but research for an entire year when she has a writing assignment. And she'll do nothing, but she researches. She doesn't write a thing. And then she goes up to a small town in Northern California and she books a motel room for 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks, she'll write the screenplay after having done research and thinking about these characters for a year. Now, David Lynch, who just died, he used to write his scene ideas on 3x5 cards. And he would collect the cards until he had 70 cards, which is roughly, most movies have about 70 to 80 scenes. Then he would put them up on a whiteboard so he could look at them and see how that they would go left to right in time. And he would shift them around and see what has to be here. And when he was satisfied with the way the scenes looked to him on the wall, then he would sit down and write the scenes. He generally directed everything he wrote. So, but I've worked that way. I've worked that way in my documentary. It's certainly helpful to do that. Now, if you want to work professionally, or even if you're going to work for yourself, that I would definitely use a screenwriting program. And Final Draft is the industry standard. There are other programs, but almost everybody works in Final Draft because it formats the script in the standard form that everybody wants to see automatically. Well, so as a screenwriter, the camera should be uppermost in your mind. And when you're writing these things, you don't want to use a passive voice. You want to use active verbs and present tense, because the film takes place in front of your eyes as if it is happening for the first time. And your job as a screenwriter is to establish the style in the entire script. And the first thing you want to write is something that they call the seduction draft. And that is, you're trying to get people seduced to how great this movie is, how wonderful an expression. It'll win all these awards. We're going to make a fortune on it. And the thing about screenplays are, because they're a blueprint, they're not perfect. So you're not striving for perfection. You're striving for people's attention. And then later you will write production drafts. You may eliminate scenes, your budget changes, you have to eliminate a crowd scene or a car crash. And you adapt to it, because what you're going to hand off to the director is a blueprint. And then he will take it and fill it out with actors, with sets, with cars if you need them in the car crash, with music, with sound, with editing. He will orchestrate getting it to the end of production. But in the screenplay, you want to see the visual action in your mind, see what people are doing, and represent that. And you want to have down on the page just what we're seeing on the screen. And one of your jobs is to not throw the reader out of the screenplay, because this is meant to be readable and entertaining. What you're doing is establishing the tone of the material. Like if it's a comedy, it'll be funny. If it's a drama, it'll be exciting. If it's an action movie, it'll be crazy exciting. And one of the things about writing a screenplay is that nonverbal content is very hard to convey. Conveying the emotion by just describing the picture, but that's your job. And you can tell the reader how a character feels. And your job is to make it interesting, make it lively. And action and dialogue are simultaneously, but you want to always start with the visual so the reader can see something, then they hear, then they can follow the action and the dialogue. You want to create an atmosphere. It's very important to create mood and atmosphere in a screenplay. And dialogue conveys the sizzle. And scenes, you want to try and make them alive and try to get the actors on their feet. You don't want to have scenes that are sitting at a table or in a booth or static. You want to give them, the actors, room to act. And when you describe the character, you want the main character to be able to lead you into the story, his behavior and his acting when he first meets them. And that will compel you to keep going on the rest of the story. And the entire art of screenwriting is to surprise the audience with what they are expecting. If they expect this, you give them something else. So they're continually paying attention, to the movie. Okay, on the state of the art, basically now screenwriters are making less money because there's a lot of content out in the current state of events. So it's the best of times and the worst of times. There's a lot of work and a lot of need for content is what they're calling it. And today, the movie and streaming business and television itself is currently very volatile and highly competitive. And what most people think is that there's going to be a lot of consolidation between the various streamers and studios and the change. And most of this is due to a real shift in the audience because of COVID that moved, the theater business is still off 30 to 40%, and the entire movie business is off. And that's gone into streaming. The streaming companies, Netflix is going crazy. They have a ton of money, but they have more money than anybody else. Uh, some of the other streamers are having trouble because they're producing so much content. Um, But the bad part about that is Netflix and none of the streamers are paying what they used to for screenwriting. And even all the production crafts are down since the strikes last year. And there's just a general gut of series, of films, of reality shows, documentaries. I mean, you guys probably all have streaming, so you know what I'm talking about. And again, Los Angeles is still the heart of this world. It really operates out of there. There are other places. London's very big. New York has big. Canada has, both Vancouver and Toronto are big places, but nothing is like Los Angeles. A lot of the money is there. That's where you go to get stuff to be produced. And if you want to understand today's market better in terms of visual storytelling and screen, I would read Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, that handles mostly the business and selling end of things. There are a lot of good podcasts. There's one called The Treatment and The Town. They both talk about Hollywood, the mood of the town, what they're buying, what they're not, and search around. There's also screenwriting and a lot of crafts podcasts. And a lot of these people are very experienced, and it helps to get a sense of if what you're interested in, your specific story, where that would whether there's an opening for that or a need for that, or it, these are all kind of personal decisions, and we'll get to that in a minute. So if you have published works or if you have an unpublished work, one of the questions you want to ask yourself is this story visual? And does it have compelling scenes? And roughly 70 of them if you want to make a feature film. And are the characters compelling? Uh, it's very hard to make a movie about a character who's not very compelling. If all the dialogue, it's interior monologues, you can make them, but it's not really what films do the best. It's moving pictures. So those elements, you want to analyze your story and try to be, really tough on it and say, does I really have that? And there's ways to do this. I mean, there's one writer I know of that how he did adaptations. He did adaptations from uh, uh, generally popular books, but he would read the book 3 times, and each time he would read it, he would underline in a different color what each scene or bit of dialogue or whatever would be included in the movie. And then he'd go back and he'd read it again, and he'd do the same things using red instead of yellow. And then the third time he'd go back, he'd do the entire book again, underlining in blue. And what he did was, after the third reading, he would just go to the scenes that had been underlined 3 times, and then he would lift those out. The other thing you can do, if you have a very long work that you're doing, you can look for an interesting subplot or a section of the movie that will make it a section of the book that will make its own movie. Because, like most of us know, it takes sometimes 8 to 20 hours to read a book. Now, that is not, it's going to be very hard to compress that into a film. And we've all been disappointed when whatever we had in our heads from reading the book was not, we did not see on the screen, because the writer has to compress and make this 1.5 to 2 hour story out of a 12-hour or 20-hour book. And the other thing to do if you're evaluating your own work, or if somebody wants to hire you to create a screenplay, is to try and break the work down into log lines, 1-page synopses, and 15 to 30-page treatments. And that's just trial and error. But it's your structural work is trying to take these things apart and seeing what you be able to put up onto the screen. And you could even do those 70 scenes of cards and do that. And that's a way to analyze both the piece that you have, and it's also practice. A lot of this is practice in being able to see something and keep yourself open and growing and alive. So after you decide you want to adapt something, I think that depending on what kind of writing you're doing or have done, I think you need to think about what role do you want to play as a writer. Do you really want to be a screenwriter? Do you want to write novels and then I'd like to collaborate on it? Do you like to maybe make your own movie? You're interested in directing? Are you interested in working on some stuff? And in some ways it depends on you, for one, and what your desires are and what your skills are. And it also depends on the source material and your own instincts. Like if you wanted to do Ulysses, if you wanted to film Ulysses, then you're on your own. It's in the public domain. And if you want to spend time trying to turn that into a screenplay or a series, that's your choice, and the rules are different, of course. So one of the questions you want to ask yourself, is this a bestseller or is it a small, intimate work? Now, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, Amy Tan, after she wrote the bestseller, The Joy Luck Hub, well, she already had agents. The book was very successful. I think it's sold 6 million copies. At the time, I think they made the movie about 300,000 copies. But she was very interested in film. And in fact, she started out being a screenwriter. But anyway, so she had representation, and she ended up getting together with the screenwriter Ron Bass, who won the Oscar for Rain Man, and he collaborated on the screenplay with Joy Luck Club with her. And then Amy also produced the film with Oliver Stone, Wayne Wang, Ron Bass, and a couple other people. And they had final cut, which is highly unusual. They got to decide how long the film was and what was going to go out. And the film was very successful, both artistically and financially. Now, this is probably a best case scenario. If you write or have written a bestseller, then I would probably, if it was me, take it to your agent, have your agent reach out to a screen agent, see if there's any interest in the studios or Netflix into buying the property unproduced, and proceed that way. Or write the screenplay yourself and have your agent get an agent for you to take it out. Or you can do what I just did, which is I wrote an unpublished novel called Dark Gate, and then I adapted it into a screenplay, and I was going to shoot it, but I gave it to an actor friend of mine 5 or 6 years ago. And about a year ago, he called me up and said, let's shoot this. So last December, we went pre-produced and shot the film at a micro budget level, which is under $100,000 in San Francisco. And now we're editing the film. I tried to sell it, but I didn't try very hard. And he offered to get it made, and I had a small part in the film. And I even did think before he came along of shooting it on an iPhone. So if you do have a story and you're interested and it's got a fairly limited size, you can think about that if you're interested in filmmaking. Um, and one of the questions you want to ask yourself if you're going to want to write for the screen is how much time do you want to spend doing it? I think it's a very hard form. Uh, it's not a fun form like the way prose writing is fun. It can be fun. It's not always fun, but it can be fun, and there's a certain level of success you get from just seeing it on the screen. Your own writing or seeing it printed or having somebody read it, even if it doesn't get a very wide distribution. But it's very hard to get that if you're writing big films. I knew a guy who's retired now, and he worked as a screenwriter his entire career from when he was 20s till his 70s. And he made a very good living at a big house in LA with um, uh, swimming pool in a beautiful part of town, nice salaries. He wrote for 45 years and he never had a single film made. And that would have driven me nuts. Um, so I don't think that's as possible to do anymore. But it can be somewhat frustrating if you're working as a screenwriter, if you want to see more work, because there's a lot of writing that never gets, they only make, who knows, 1 out of 10 things, 1 out of 20. I would love to collaborate with another skilled writer and director. It was with the co-director of mine on Dark Gate. It's wonderful when you have other people working with you, because I work a lot as a prose writer, and it's, you're alone most of the time, you and the screen, and that's it. Um, Again, film is a collaborative mass media art form, and there is complex and imaginative considerations that go across those dozen disciplines that we've talked about. And also, I think it's like fiction and nonfiction. It's a matter of fitting your desires and skills to the art form. If you love imagery, if you love structure, you love acting, and you want to learn screenwriting, follow your passion. Start studying it, start writing screenplays, read screenplays. There's a number of workshops you can attend. But if you would rather concentrate on fiction and nonfiction, I would keep doing that. And then if you want to take it further, try to collaborate with a screenwriter. If the scale or the interest of your projects, like, if you were doing something on UFOs in Roswell, maybe you'd find somebody local that would be interested in that, and you could develop your project, you could write it, and both of you could throw a little money in, and you could push this thing along. I mean, it's really it's very broad in what you could choose to do, and it doesn't even in that sense have to be commercial. And anybody, if you were really interested in working in this media, what I would suggest was that you take a scene of 3 to 10 minutes from one of your stories or your novels or your articles, write yourself a short screenplay, then get a couple friends and shoot the scene at your house or some other location that's easy to get. And then I would edit it on your phone or iPad or computer with iMovie or Final Cut or whatever. And if you enjoy this process or this turns you on, then you could expand that into a longer work, with what you've learned, and then either try to sell it or produce a micro budget feature like we're doing. It sounds like a lot of money, but if you got a passion for it, there's a potential for making some money. Adapting. Next thing I'd like to talk about is that adapting for streaming. Now, if your story is long, or if it's episodic in nature, or maybe it's a reality situation, or it's a family ensemble melodrama, and by which I mean, you know, not a soap opera, but just a family drama. Um, one of the um, things you need for episodics is having the potential for many scenes. And the episodic, that might be the best form for you, you know, and currently mostly these run from like 3 episodes of an hour to an hour and a half each to hundreds, or in the case of soap operas, to thousands. You know, some of these soap operas have been running, you know, for 10, 15 years. Um, so what you need for those is to have really compelling characters. The constellation of characters is what you need to spend your time on. Is how do all these people keep creating different angles for stories that we can keep extending this thing, you know? And everybody has their favorite uh, episodics, but it's, you know, like Seinfeld or Friends for older, uh, you know, Will and Grace. There's tons of them, but but they were developed. The characters were developed a lot in order to suggest a lot of episodic situations that they could keep playing on these. Um, the one part of this, it's harder to do if you're going to do these at a low budget or no budget. And in Hollywood and essentially there's something called a showrunner, and they're really essential to getting good streaming shows that are going to play on the network. And if you have an agent or if you have a manager, they can get your material to the showrunners. It's a highly competitive situation for episodic work, and it had, unfortunately, it has an age component. It's like a lot of other crafts, like lawyers. You know, lawyers, when you're in the first 5 to 10 years of your work, they work you to death, and the older guys just take the big good cases. Um, so it's similar to that in the writers' rooms. You know, they tend to have. And to give you an example of how competitive it is, I have a good friend, and she's written 8 Hollywood features, and she's been trying to get episodic work for 15 years and has yet to even do an episode. And she did a couple of them when she was in her younger years. So, and I think that's mostly an age-related thing because she's in her 60s. Um, Generally, when you're developing an episodic, you need to write a pilot, and that, you know, that establishes the structure and the ensemble of compelling and complex characters. You know, like when Seinfeld, you know, they had those those 4 very compelling characters, and then put them in a situation, and then it also, because the characters were so quirky and funny, that it had enough story potential, you know. And you need to think about um, 6 to 8 episodes in blocks, and then that will also allow multiple seasons. Um, so if you can look at old episodics and see how they do it, and how the characters will encourage more dramatic situations that the writers can think up as the show goes on. And the way these things are developed is that a showrunner will get an idea, and a lot of them are writers too, and they'll take out and they'll make a book. And the book, what would be in the book is a detailed biography of characters, and then a pilot script that will be done in half an hour or an hour, that will be an example, and then an outline of probably 10 pages an episode for a season's worth of the episodes. With the, you know, they were essentially short treatments for each episode, and then they put in a director or an actor if they say they're interested. um, you know, that's part of it, and they'll take this package out and they'll go to a studio or to the episodics and say, or to Netflix and say, I got this. Are you interested? And they'll go, yes, no, maybe. Okay, here, we'll finance the pilot. Give us a half hour, and then we'll tell you whether. And then there's a thing they have in LA called pilot month, I think it is, where they shoot all these pilots, and then the studio people and Netflix get together, and the TV networks, and they decide which new shows they're going to pick up, and then they'll finance the entire season. Um, uh, so afterwards, then once it gets picked up, then the showrunner, the creator, producer will then hire the cast and the crew, and then they'll form a writer's room where 3 to 6 writers will get together, and they'll start writing the dramatic arc of the season and the characters and how they advance. And then each of those writers will probably be assigned an individual episode, which they will write up to production quality, and then they'll present to the other writers and the showrunner, and they'll go through the script and try to improve it, because all of them know all of the characters. So it's 6 or 7 minds trying to solve story problems and character problems. And essentially that's how you work in the doing episodics. So I am at the end of my block here, and I think I'd like to take questions if anybody has questions.
Christopher, I was wondering
Yeah.
if you were aware that there's a Netflix studio here in this area.
Yeah. Yeah, they have a big presence in Albuquerque. I think they have, what, 6 or 7 stages, and they're building more. I don't know whether they develop stuff here. I think they mostly shoot stuff here. I think that the offices in that they develop them and work on them mostly in Los Angeles.
2 questions. The first, once
Yeah.
upon a time, I knew where to find scripts online. Do you have any suggestions where to find movie scripts or other TV scripts?
Yeah, I used to get a lot of them offline. I haven't lately. I have a pretty big bank of them, but I would just do searches. They're yeah, I would just do a Google search and ask for scripts online. I think I still have a bank of them somewhere. You could email me if you wanted. I could see if you wanted some. I think they still publish them. I would do some searching for that, because I used to put this out to some of my friends and a few clients, that generally the Academy scripts that are up for those you can find fairly easily, because they circulate them so people will read them and decide whether they get an Academy nomination. All the nominated scripts should be fairly easy, and those are pretty good crew to start with, because they've gotten nominated by other screenwriters. Screenwriters nominate screenwriters. I would do a search, because I'm sure you can get them for free and get PDFs of them.
Another
I think
question.
it's you can look up Drew's Scriptorama. Scriptorama, Drew, Drew. Yeah.
How much should you limit internal monologue, or is that to be avoided because it's not visual?
Yeah, I would. If you're beginning, I would avoid it. It's kind of a bad habit to get into, because if you can, try to find another way to get that information out, either in a conversation with somebody. It can be done, but it's just not the best way to do things. It doesn't. Part of what we're doing is creating conflict, and it's hard to create conflict with yourself when you're talking your internal monologue, and there's no other filter. If you have another person there, you can see the exchange between the two of them, and so you can feel where your character is off his axis and where the other character is, and you can monitor this through the dialogue between the two of them. You can invent another character and do that monologue and see what the other character says. I mean, I would try it that way, make a scene out of it if you feel the impulse, because you're generally trying to reveal an internal state. When you're doing an interior monologue, you're going to say something, but another person can take that out of you too, like a buddy character, or an intimate relationship, or even somebody who doesn't know you and you're never going to see again. A lot of times you could find somebody goes into a bar, talks to this guy or this woman and tells her the interior monologue he can't tell anybody else, because who cares what she thinks? I'll never see her again. So I would think of an alternative way to do it rather than as an interior monologue. It's not that you can't do it. It's just that I wouldn't start out trying to do that. Try to do the other first. And then if you can't do that, then you can find a way, like I said, those ways.
2 more questions. Quick one.
Okay.
What
Yeah.
editing software do you prefer? And then the second one is, can you describe what you would teach in your workshop?
In the workshop, I'd be going in deeper on everything, more practical craft, different forms, and how to craft these, and a deeper structural understanding. And then I'd also want to do practicals with whatever they want to adapt, that I think that we can use for examples. We could take people's stories and we would go through them and structure them out, consider which form they're best for, and how we would go about it, and what we would use in the which of the scenes we might use, how we would choose them, and what would be the most easily adapted and the most effective.
Okay. And what editing software do you prefer?
It's kind of funny. The last thing I edited on was Final Cut Pro, but I probably wouldn't do that again. I'm probably going to use Blackmagic for editing. I have worked on I've worked on Final Cut Pro. I've actually worked in 3 or 4 of them. I worked in Avid a little bit, but I would probably do Blackmagic. They have a huge program. I haven't used Celtex. In fact, I shouldn't say that. I did use it, but I don't know. I like Blackmagic and Final Cut and Avid. Those are pretty much the big guys right now. And their Blackmagic is pretty good. It's almost as good as the old Final Cut Pro. There's a couple things that they don't do, but I just found out one workaround, and I have friends that have changed to it. So I think Celtex is screenwriting, actually, Jacqueline. I mean, I would use Final Draft. I wouldn't fool with any other program, unless you really like writing in something and they have a good screen. Final Draft is really, I'd say it's 95% the professional program to use. It's simple, and they have a good educational deal if you're teaching or if you're taking classes somewhere.
I was wondering, I heard you mention Blackmagic. Is that the same as DaVinci Resolve? I think they're the same
Yes.
company, aren't they?
Yeah, Blackmagic is the company. DaVinci
okay.
Resolve is the program. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a big program, but it's immense. It's really a color correction program. It started out, but they keep improving the editing program.
They have a free copy that has
Yep.
most of what you need, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, you can. That's true. Or I think it depends on if you want to output, you have to pay the 300. You can mostly use it for yourself. But if you want to create output, professional output, then it's probably best to pay the license. The other part of it is they update it for free. So that's a one time in your lifetime to pay that $300. You know, they're not like Adobe and they charge you every month.
Right, right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, any other questions, comments I've missed? Oh, again, I just want to tell you, I just found this whole talk very inspiring. I want to go out and write a
Thank you.
screenplay now, even if you did discourage me on getting it sold. And other than that, I just want to lead a round of applause.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.